Amid the chaos of a big city, an exhausted mother pretends she isn't hungry so she can feed her daughter. But a silent gesture from a stranger changes everything without asking for anything in return. What begins with a plate of food becomes a new chance for three broken hearts to rebuild together. The morning light streamed through the white linen curtains of the apartment in Brighton Marina, casting golden stripes across the light wooden floor. Mary adjusted her cotton dress over her 6-month pregnant belly, feeling the comforting weight of the life growing within her. The smell of fresh coffee wafted from the kitchen, but something in the silence of the house felt different that Tuesday in March. Roderick had already left for work without waking her, leaving only a short note on the kitchen counter saying he had an important meeting and would be back late. She held the note between her fingers, observing her husband's hasty handwriting. There was something mechanical in those words, a coldness that didn't match the man who used to leave affectionate messages, drawing hearts around his own name. Mary shook her head, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling growing in her chest. Perhaps it was just pregnancy hormones, she thought, tossing the paper into the bin and pouring herself a latte. The apartment, which once seemed cozy with its light furniture and plants scattered in the corners, now carried a heavy silence. Mary walked to the balcony and watched the distant movement of the beach. Couples walked along the stone-paved promenade, street vendors set up their stalls, and the sea stretched endlessly under the blue London sky. Everything seemed normal outside, but inside her something was changing. Over the past 2 months, Roderick had become a distant version of himself. The man who had courted her with such intensity 3 years ago, the successful architect who would recite impromptu poems while they cooked together, now barely looked her in the eye during dinner. Conversations had become superficial, limited to practical matters about the baby's nursery renovation or bills to pay. When she tried to touch on deeper subjects, he would look away and invent some excuse to leave the room. Mary remembered how different everything had been at the beginning. They met at an art exhibition at the Tate Modern, both standing before the same abstract painting, trying to decipher its meanings. Roderick made a funny comment about the shapes on the canvas. She laughed, and from there an instant connection was born. In the following months, they were inseparable. He took her to discover hidden cafes in Notting Hill, planned picnics in Hyde Park, and stayed up late talking about dreams and fears. When he asked for her hand in marriage, on a rainy afternoon on the balcony of the apartment they had just bought together, Mary felt she had finally found her place in the world. The pregnancy was planned, desired by both. Mary still remembered Roderick's expression when she showed him the positive test, his eyes shining with emotion, hugging her so tightly that she had to remind him to be gentle. In the first few months, he was attentive, accompanying her to all medical appointments, reading books about fatherhood, and had already assembled half of the cot himself. But something changed after she entered the second trimester. First, it was the meetings that stretched longer and longer. Roderick worked for a large construction company specializing in high-end developments and always had an intense routine, but now he left home before 7 in the morning and returned after 10 at night, always with the same tired excuse about tight deadlines and demanding clients. When she suggested he work a little less, at least until the baby was born, he would get defensive and change the subject. Then came the phone calls. Roderick always answered his cell phone in another room, speaking softly with a tone she didn't recognize. When she asked who it was, he would reply vaguely that it was work, always work. His phone now had a password, something that had never been between them. Mary tried not to think too much about it, but suspicion began to grow like a weed in her heart. The previous week, something specific had caught her attention. It was Sunday afternoon, and Roderick was napping on the sofa with his phone beside him. A notification lit up the screen, and Mary, who was passing by with a basket of clean laundry, couldn't help but see it. It was a short message, just a letter followed by a red heart emoji. Her entire body went cold. Roderick woke up seconds later, quickly grabbed the phone, and left the room without explanation. Since then, Mary couldn't stop thinking about that message. Who was the person behind that initial? Why would they send a heart to her husband? She tried to talk to Roderick that night, but he assured her it was just a colleague who had sent a message celebrating the closing of a contract. The explanation sounded false, rehearsed, but Mary didn't have the courage to confront him directly. Not yet. Now, standing on the balcony with the cup of coffee cooling in her hands, Mary felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. She needed answers. She couldn't continue living in that limbo of suspicions and half-truths. The baby deserved to be born into a home built on trust, not on secrets. She decided she would go to the construction company where Roderick worked, not to cause a scene, but to see for herself if he was really as busy as he claimed. Perhaps it was paranoia. Perhaps it was just the normal fears of a pregnant woman facing such big changes. But she needed to know. Mary took a quick shower, put on high-waisted trousers and a loose blouse that somewhat disguised her belly, and left the apartment. The March heat in London was stifling, and she felt sweat begin to form on her forehead as she waited for the lift. In the taxi, she watched the city pass by the window, the busy streets of Brighton Marina giving way to the corporate buildings of Canary Wharf. The construction company was located in a modern mirrored glass building with an immense lobby decorated with tropical plants and a water feature in the center. Mary entered with a pounding heart, approaching the reception. The attendant, a young woman with her hair tied in an impeccable bun, smiled politely and asked if she could help. Before Mary could answer, she heard Roderick's voice coming from the side corridor. Instinctively, she hid behind a marble column, observing. Her husband was walking beside a tall woman with long, straight hair, wearing a perfectly tailored grey suit. They were talking softly, and there was an intimacy in the way she touched his arm, how he leaned in to hear what she was saying. Mary felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. They entered the lift together, unaware of her presence. Mary stood there, unable to move, unable to process what she had just seen. It wasn't just the physical proximity, but the body language between them, the ease, the complicity. It was the way Roderick used to behave with her at the beginning of their relationship. With trembling legs, Mary left the building and wandered aimlessly through the streets of Canary Wharf. Tears began to stream uncontrollably, blurring her vision. People hurried past, oblivious to the silent collapse happening within her. She sat on a park bench, hugging her belly, as if to protect the baby from the pain she felt. Memories began to flood her mind like relentless waves. Roderick preparing breakfast in bed for her on a rainy Sunday, scattering rose petals around the room. The two of them dancing barefoot in the living room to the sound of smooth jazz, laughing at their clumsy attempts to follow the rhythm. The night he knelt before her with the ring, promising eternal love, saying she was the woman he had always waited to find. How could all those promises have turned into this? Mary wiped away her tears and tried to take a deep breath. She needed to be strong, for the baby, for herself. But the pain was physical, a pressure in her chest that made every breath difficult. She picked up her phone and called the only person she fully trusted, her brother Raphael. Raphael answered on the third ring, his voice concerned as he noticed her tone. He lived in Chelsea, just a few minutes away, and insisted she come to his apartment immediately. Mary agreed, grateful to have someone to support her at that moment. At Raphael's apartment, she finally managed to talk about everything she had been feeling, about her suspicions, about the scene she had witnessed at the construction company. Raphael, an investigative journalist with a keen instinct for lies, listened attentively, his expression growing increasingly serious. He held his sister's hand and promised he would help her discover the truth, but asked her to remain calm and careful, especially because of the baby. When Mary returned home late that afternoon, Roderick had not yet arrived. She mechanically prepared dinner, feeling like an actress playing the role of a happy wife in a play that no longer made sense. When he finally arrived, it was almost 9 at night. He entered with his usual tired expression, threw his briefcase on the sofa, and went straight to the shower without even greeting her properly. During dinner, Mary watched him in silence. Roderick ate distractedly, checking his phone every few minutes. She wanted to scream, wanted to throw the plate against the wall, wanted to demand answers, but something made her remain silent, just observing the stranger her husband had become. That night, lying beside him in bed, Mary heard Roderick's regular breathing and knew he was asleep. She, however, remained awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, feeling the baby move inside her, and wondering how everything had come to that point. The following days dragged on in a mechanical and painful routine. Mary woke up alone, had coffee alone, and spent the hours trying to keep her mind busy with preparations for the baby's arrival. But everything seemed empty now, stripped of the meaning it should have. Every blanket she folded, every tiny outfit she organized in the nursery dresser, everything carried the weight of an unanswered question. Would this baby be raised in a complete family, or would it grow up amidst ruins? Raphael visited her almost every day, bringing fresh fruit from the market and company. He was 3 years younger than Mary, but always showed a protective maturity towards his sister. Since their parents died in a car accident 5 years ago, they had become even closer, depending on each other to bear the pain of loss. Raphael had never fully liked Roderick, though he always respected his sister's choice. Now, seeing her suffer, he could barely disguise the contempt he felt for his brother-in-law. One Thursday afternoon, while drinking passion fruit juice on Mary's balcony, Raphael suggested she hire a private investigator. At first, she resisted the idea, feeling it would be a violation of her husband's privacy, a definitive admission that the trust between them was completely destroyed. But Raphael argued that she needed concrete facts, not just assumptions and anxiety. If Roderick was innocent, great, they could work to rebuild trust. But if something was truly going on, she would need to know the extent of the situation before making any important decisions. Mary spent the night thinking about her brother's suggestion. Lying in bed, next to Roderick, who was sleeping soundly, she found herself diving into memories of happier times, as if her brain desperately searched for proof that it was all a mistake, a misunderstanding that could be undone. She remembered their first year of marriage, when they still lived in a smaller apartment in Islington. Roderick would come home from work and find her in the kitchen, trying to follow some complicated recipe she had seen online. He would hug her from behind, kiss her neck, and say it didn't matter if the food was bad, because being with her was already the best dinner in the world. Then they would eat sitting on the living room floor, watching old movies and commenting on the actors, the soundtracks, the costumes. There were also the trips. Roderick loved planning weekend getaways to historical towns. In the Cotswolds, they explored Bath, Oxford, Canterbury, walking hand in hand through the cobbled streets, entering ancient churches and tasting homemade sweets in local confectionaries. On one of these trips, sitting at a viewpoint from which they could see the entire city lit up at dusk, Roderick had spoken for the first time about having children. He said he wanted to build a family with her, raise children who would grow up with love, security, and freedom to dream. Mary cried with happiness at that moment, feeling that her deepest dreams were aligning perfectly with his. The decision to get pregnant came naturally, as a logical next step desired by both. When it finally happened after a few months of trying, the joy was immense. Roderick told everyone, called his late in-laws, knowing they would have been proud, celebrated with friends. He bought books on child development, started researching schools, and spent hours talking to her belly, telling invented stories about a magical kingdom where the baby would be the prince or princess. But when did the change begin? Mary tried to pinpoint the exact moment Roderick started to pull away. It was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. First, he stopped making those small surprises, the affectionate notes left in unexpected places, the flowers bought for no specific reason. Then conversations became shorter, less profound. He started coming home late more frequently, always with work-related justifications. And then came the physical distancing. Hugs became quick and mechanical, kisses were just superficial touches, and they hadn't made love in almost 2 months. On Friday morning, Mary woke up with a decision made. She would call the private investigator Raphael had recommended. She needed to know the truth, however painful it might be. She couldn't continue living in that torturous uncertainty. The investigator, a middle-aged man named Paul, answered her call with discreet professionalism. They arranged to meet the next day at a cafe in Canary Wharf, far enough from Brighton Marina to avoid acquaintances. Mary felt a knot in her stomach as she hung up the phone. She was officially initiating an investigation into her own husband. How had they come to this? That afternoon, she had a routine appointment with her obstetrician. Roderick had promised to accompany her this time, as he had missed the last 3 appointments. But when it was time to leave, he sent a message, saying an urgent problem had arisen at the office and that she should go alone. Mary read the message 3 times, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. She called a taxi and went alone, as she had been doing for the past few weeks. The appointment was smooth. The doctor, Dr. Helen, examined her carefully and said that both she and the baby were healthy. But she noticed something in Mary's face and asked if everything was all right. Mary tried to smile and say yes, but tears began to fall before she could control them. Dr. Helen, a kind woman in her 50s, sat beside her and held her hand, allowing her to confide. Mary told her about her suspicions, about Roderick's distancing, about the fear of raising a child alone. The doctor listened patiently and then said something that stuck in Mary's mind. She said that regardless of what happened to the marriage, Mary was creating a life, and that child was already loved by her. She said that a mother's strength is greater than any adversity, and that she would be able to overcome whatever lay ahead. The words brought unexpected comfort, a reminder that she was not completely helpless. After the appointment, Mary decided to walk a bit before returning home. The clinic was in a building near Westfield, London, and she took the opportunity to go in and distract her mind by looking at shop windows. It was in a children's clothing store that she had a moment of clarity. Looking at a light blue romper with star designs, she imagined her child wearing that outfit, imagined herself cradling him, singing lullabies, being a mother. And she realized that whatever happened with Roderick, she wanted this child more than anything in the world. This baby was not just the fruit of a relationship that might be crumbling. It was a unique person who deserved all the love she could give. She bought the romper and left the shopping center with renewed determination. She would not allow Roderick's betrayal, if there was a betrayal, to destroy her ability to be happy or to raise her child in a loving environment. She was stronger than she imagined. On the way back home, she decided to stop by the supermarket. While choosing fruits and vegetables, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She answered with hesitation. On the other end of the line, a female voice, cold and controlled, said her name as if it were a statement, not a question. Mary confirmed, feeling a shiver run down her spine. The woman laughed briefly and said they needed to talk, in person. Before Mary could ask who it was or what it was about, the call ended. Mary's heart pounded. Who was that woman? What did she want? The voice was unfamiliar to her, but there was something unsettling in the way she spoke, an arrogant certainty that sounded like a veiled threat. Mary looked around. The supermarket, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable. She quickly paid for her purchases and left, calling a taxi to take her directly home. At home, she locked the door and sat on the sofa, trying to process what had just happened. She called Raphael and told him about the mysterious call. He was immediately alarmed and said he would come over. While waiting for her brother, Mary couldn't stop thinking. Could that woman be the same one she had seen with Roderick at the construction company? How did she get her number? What did she mean by that conversation? Raphael arrived in less than half an hour, visibly concerned. They talked at length about the situation, and he insisted that Mary should not meet that person alone, that it could be dangerous. But Mary felt she needed to know who it was and what she wanted. Perhaps this was the confirmation she sought, however painful it might be. That night, Roderick came home after midnight. Mary was still awake, sitting in the living room in the dark, with only the city lights coming through the windows. He seemed surprised to see her there and asked if everything was all right. She looked at him, really looked, trying to find traces of the man she had fallen in love with, but all she saw was a tired stranger, wearing the skin of the husband she had known. She asked directly if there was another woman. The question left her mouth before she could reconsider. Roderick was paralyzed for a moment, his eyes widening. Then he vehemently denied it, saying she was being paranoid, that it was just pregnancy hormones creating problems where none existed. He said he was working hard to ensure financial stability for the family, that she should be grateful, instead of inventing fantasies. The words were harsh, defensive, and confirmed for Mary that something was deeply wrong. She didn't argue, just got up and went to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Roderick stayed in the living room, and she could hear him pacing back and forth for almost an hour before he finally lay down on the sofa. Lying in bed, with her hand on her belly feeling the baby's gentle movements, Mary made a decision. The next day, she would meet the investigator and do whatever was necessary to discover the whole truth. The cafe where Mary met Paul, the private investigator, was small and discreet, hidden on a side street in Canary Wharf. The establishment had only 6 tables, all empty that Saturday morning. Paul was an ordinary-looking man, the kind of person who would go unnoticed in a crowd, and Mary imagined that this was probably an advantage in his profession. He listened attentively as she spoke about the changes in Roderick's behavior, about the woman she had seen at the construction company, about the mysterious call. Paul took notes in a small notebook, asking specific questions about times, locations, and details. When Mary finished, he closed the notebook and explained how the investigation would work. He would discreetly follow Roderick for a few days, document his movements and contacts, and then present a full report with photographic evidence, if there was anything relevant to document. Mary signed the necessary papers and paid the advance, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. Part of her still hoped that it was all a misunderstanding, that Roderick was innocent, and they could rebuild the lost trust. But another part, more pragmatic and wounded, was already preparing for the worst. In the following days, Mary tried to maintain an appearance of normality. Roderick continued his routine of leaving early and returning late, and they barely spoke beyond practical day-to-day matters. The tension between them was palpable, filling every room of the apartment like an invisible but suffocating fog. The following Tuesday, Paul called requesting an urgent meeting. They met at the same cafe, and this time the investigator's face was serious. He opened a brown envelope and placed a series of photographs on the table. Mary felt the air leave her lungs. The photos showed Roderick with a woman, the same one she had seen at the construction company. In some images, they were having lunch together in an elegant restaurant in Chelsea, sitting very close, she touching his hand across the table. In others, they were leaving the office together towards the car park. And there was one, particularly painful, where they were kissing inside a car in the basement of a residential building. Paul explained that the woman's name was Gabrielle Norris. She was 32 years old and a project manager at the same construction company where Roderick worked. She lived alone in a luxurious apartment in Kensington, drove an imported car, and had apparently been in a relationship with Roderick for at least 4 months, according to information he had gathered from contacts within the company. Mary held the photographs with trembling hands, feeling nausea rise in her throat. Seeing the visual confirmation of her suspicions was like a punch to the gut. All of Roderick's denials, all the times he had made her feel paranoid, it was all a lie. He was effectively having an affair with that woman while she carried his child. Paul continued speaking, explaining that he had discovered more disturbing information. Apparently, Gabrielle had a complicated reputation at the office. Several colleagues commented on her obsessive behavior in previous relationships. There were rumors that she had stalked an ex-boyfriend until he had to move cities, although none of this had been officially proven or reported. Paul also discovered that she came from a troubled family, having grown up in shelters after being abandoned by her biological mother, and had been adopted at 12 by a wealthy couple who divorced 3 years later, each going their separate ways with little contact with her. Mary absorbed this information with difficulty, so it wasn't just a common betrayal. There were layers of complications she hadn't even imagined, and that mysterious call she had received. Paul confirmed her suspicions that it was probably Gabrielle, perhaps wanting to mark her territory or intimidate her. Leaving the cafe, Mary walked aimlessly for some time, the photographs in her bag weighing like stones. The city was bustling, full of people coming and going with their normal lives, oblivious to the personal drama she was experiencing. How was it possible that everything seemed so normal outside when her world was falling apart? She called Raphael, who met her in a nearby park. Upon seeing the photos, his face turned red with anger. He wanted to confront Roderick immediately, but Mary asked him to wait. She needed to think clearly about the next steps. She had a baby to think about, a life to reorganize. She couldn't just act on impulse. That night, For the first time, Mary didn't prepare dinner. When Roderick arrived and asked about food, she simply said she wasn't feeling well and locked herself in the bedroom. She heard him rummaging in the kitchen, probably ordering delivery, and then the sound of the television on in the living room. Everything so routine, so normal, while the horrible truth hung between them like an unrecognized ghost. The next morning, Mary had another medical appointment, this time a more detailed ultrasound. Roderick surprisingly remembered and offered to accompany her. She accepted, curious to see how he would act, how he would manage to play the role of attentive husband, knowing what she now knew. The clinic was crowded, and they waited in silence in the waiting room, each looking in different directions. When they were called, the technician applied the cold gel to Mary's belly and began the examination. The baby's image appeared on the screen, and the technician pointed out the details: the strong heartbeat, the perfectly formed tiny fingers, the face in profile. It was a girl, they discovered, and Mary felt tears stream down her face. She looked at Roderick and saw that he too was emotional, his eyes fixed on the screen, an expression of genuine admiration on his face. For a brief moment, Mary felt a pang of the love she used to feel for him. But then she remembered the photographs in her bag, and reality returned with full force. How could he be there, emotional about their daughter, while maintaining a parallel life with another woman? After the examination, as they walked down the corridor towards the lift, Mary suddenly felt dizzy. She leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. Roderick held her arm, concerned, asking if she was all right. She said she just needed some fresh air and would quickly go to the restroom. He waited outside, checking his phone. In the restroom, Mary splashed cold water on her face and looked at herself in the mirror. She was pale, with deep, dark circles under her eyes, and her 6-month belly was prominent under her dress. What would her life be like from now on? Would she be a single mother? Would she share custody of her daughter with Roderick? Or would she try to save the marriage somehow, swallowing the betrayal for the sake of the child? When she came out of the restroom, Roderick was no longer in the corridor. She looked for him with her eyes and saw him further ahead, talking softly on the phone, his back to her. He was saying something about needing more time, about the situation being complicated. When he noticed Mary's presence, he quickly hung up and returned to her, smiling forcedly. They went down the lift together to the underground car park. It was a large, dimly lit space, with concrete pillars painted white and the characteristic smell of motor oil and damp. Mary walked towards Roderick's car, but then heard footsteps behind them. She turned and saw a woman approaching quickly. It was Gabrielle. She recognized her immediately from the photographs, but in person, she looked even more imposing. Tall, wearing an impeccable beige suit, perfectly straight hair falling over her shoulders, and an expression of barely contained anger on her face. She wore a strong perfume that arrived before her, a striking fragrance of roses and something darker, almost cloying. Roderick froze, his expression changing from shock to panic in seconds. Mary also stopped, her heart racing. What was that woman doing there? How did she know where they would be? Gabrielle ignored Roderick completely and focused her eyes on Mary. Her voice, when she spoke, was cold and sharp like broken glass. She said they needed to have a woman-to-woman conversation, without his presence. Roderick tried to intervene, saying that it was absurd that Gabrielle needed to leave, but she silenced him, with a look so full of venom that he recoiled. Mary, trying to remain calm despite the growing fear in her chest, asked what she wanted. Gabrielle took a step forward and began to speak, her voice rising in volume with each sentence. She said that Roderick was hers, that they had been together for months, that the marriage was a farce, that Mary was just an obstacle that needed to be removed. She said that Roderick had already promised to leave her, that they had plans to be together, to build a real life. Mary looked at Roderick, searching for denial, some defense, but he merely looked away, his cowardice evident. Fury rose within her like a wave of heat. How could he stand there silent while that woman verbally attacked her? Gabrielle continued, now with tears of rage in her eyes, saying that Mary had everything, the husband, the baby, the perfect life, without deserving any of it. That she was the right person for Roderick, that they understood each other, in ways Mary could never comprehend. With each word, it became clearer that this woman was not just having an affair. She was obsessed, living in a fantasy where Roderick was completely hers. Then, in a quick and unexpected movement, Gabrielle raised the heavy leather bag she was carrying and swung it towards Mary. The blow struck her shoulder hard, making her stumble backward. The pain was instant and sharp. Mary instinctively tried to protect her belly, but Gabrielle advanced again, and this time the bag grazed her abdomen before Roderick finally reacted and placed himself between the two women. Mary felt intense pain radiating from her belly, and a terrible fear seized her. The baby, her daughter. She fell to her knees on the cold car park floor, her hands protecting her womb, trying to feel some movement. Gabrielle seemed to realize the gravity of what she had just done and recoiled, her eyes wide, before turning and running towards the exit. Mary couldn't stop trembling. Kneeling on the cold car park floor, her entire body was in shock, the pain in her shoulder and abdomen pulsating in waves that made her dizzy. Roderick was beside her, trying to help her up, but she pushed him away with a sharp gesture. She didn't want to be touched by him, not now, not after everything. With effort, she managed to lean on one of the concrete pillars and stood up. Her first concern was the baby. She placed her hands on her belly, trying to feel some movement, some sign that her daughter was all right. But all she felt was her own heart beating erratically and the persistent pain where Gabrielle's bag had hit her. Roderick was speaking, his voice sounding distant and confused. He said they needed to go to the hospital, that he would call an ambulance, that everything would be fine. Mary ignored him and picked up her own phone with trembling hands, calling Raphael. Her brother answered. On the first ring, and hearing the desperation in her voice, said he would be there in 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes seemed like an eternity. Mary sat on the floor again, leaning against the pillar, refusing any help from Roderick. He stood a few feet away, running his hands through his hair repeatedly, clearly in a panic. He tried to approach several times, but each time he did, Mary looked at him with such intensity of pain and anger that he recoiled. Raphael arrived in his car at speed, braking sharply beside them. Seeing his sister on the ground, pale and trembling, he rushed out and helped her into the back seat, with a gentleness that drastically contrasted with the fury he showed when he looked at Roderick. For a moment, it seemed he would physically assault him, but Mary held his arm and begged him to just take her to the hospital. On the way, Raphael drove quickly but carefully, weaving through traffic while keeping one hand extended back, holding Mary's. She told him everything that had happened, every detail of the confrontation in the car park, and Raphael's expression grew darker and darker. He swore that Gabrielle would pay for what she did, that he wouldn't let it go unpunished. At the hospital, Mary was immediately attended to in the emergency room. The medical team examined her carefully, monitoring the baby's heartbeat, performing an ultrasound, and checking for any serious injuries. Raphael remained by her side the entire time, holding her hand, offering words of comfort. Roderick tried to enter the examination room, but Raphael blocked his way, saying in a low but firm voice that he had already caused enough damage. After what seemed like hours of tests and agonizing waiting, relief finally came. Dr. Helen, who by coincidence was on duty that night, appeared with a comforting smile. The baby was fine, she said. The heartbeat was strong and regular. There were no signs of placental abruption or any other serious complication. Mary had suffered trauma to her shoulder and would have bruises, but nothing that would endanger her health or the child's. She recommended absolute rest for the next few days and asked her to return immediately if she felt any abdominal pain, bleeding, or reduction in fetal movements. Mary burst into tears of relief. Her daughter was safe. She was well. Raphael hugged her carefully, and even Dr. Helen, who always maintained a professional demeanor, seemed visibly moved by the patient's relief. Only then was Roderick allowed into the room where Mary was resting. He entered hesitantly, as if treading on thin ice, and stood near the door. He tried to say something, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. Mary looked at him and saw not the husband she had loved, but a weak and cowardly stranger who had destroyed their family out of pure selfishness. With a firm voice, despite her exhaustion, Mary said she didn't want to see him there. that he should do her the favor of leaving her in peace. Roderick tried to argue, saying they needed to talk, that he could explain everything, but Raphael stood up and practically pushed him out of the room. The last thing Mary heard was Roderick saying he would return the next day, that they needed to resolve the situation. That night, Mary slept in the hospital as a precaution, and Raphael remained by her side, lying in an uncomfortable armchair next to the bed. Before falling asleep, they talked softly about what would happen next. Raphael said she didn't need to return to the apartment she shared with Roderick, that she could stay with him for as long as necessary. He also suggested they file a police report against Gabrielle for the assault. Mary agreed. She wouldn't do it for revenge, but to protect herself and her daughter. That woman had proven to be unstable and dangerous, and there was no guarantee she wouldn't try something again. Raphael promised he would take care of everything, that he would contact a specialized solicitor and ensure Mary's rights were protected. The next morning, after being discharged from the hospital, Mary went straight to Raphael's apartment in Chelsea without even stopping at her own home to pick up clothes. Raphael went alone to get her belongings, finding Roderick asleep on the sofa, surrounded by empty beer bottles. There was a tense discussion where Roderick tried to justify his actions, saying that everything had gotten out of control, that he never imagined Gabrielle was capable of something like that he loved Mary and their daughter. Raphael replied that love was not that love was respect, loyalty, and presence, things Roderick had abandoned months ago. He packed Mary's clothes and belongings and left without looking back. In the following days, settled in the guest room of Raphael's apartment, Mary began the slow process of rebuilding. The solicitor Raphael hired, Dr. Henry, was an experienced and compassionate man who guided them through the necessary steps. First, they formally reported the assault. Then, they initiated proceedings for marital separation and the establishment of child support for the upcoming child. It was during one of these conversations with Dr. Henry that something unexpected emerged. The solicitor, who had extensive contacts in the legal and corporate world of London, mentioned having heard disturbing rumours about the construction company where Roderick and Gabriel worked. There were suspicions of financial irregularities, inflated contracts, and possible money laundering. Some investors were starting to ask questions, and there were rumours of an internal investigation. Mary was surprised. She knew the construction company was large and profitable, but had always assumed everything was legitimate. Dr. Henry suggested that this could be relevant to her case, especially if Roderick was involved in something illegal. Financial information could strengthen her position in the dispute over child support and custody. It was then that Raphael had an idea. He was an investigative journalist and had skills and contacts that could be useful. He suggested investigating the construction company more deeply, not just out of professional curiosity, but to protect Mary's interests. If there was really something wrong happening, it was better that they knew before the situation exploded publicly. Mary, initially reluctant to get involved in something that seemed to go beyond her marital problems, eventually agreed. If there was corruption, if people were being deceived or harmed, that was bigger than her personal pain. And if Roderick was involved, she needed to know the extent of his lies. Raphael began the IE investigation discreetly, talking to anonymous sources, reviewing public documents and making connections. What he discovered in the first few weeks was disturbing. The construction company had received significant government contracts for infrastructure works, but the values presented were inflated, and part of the funds seemed to be diverted. There was also evidence of subcontracting phantom companies that existed only on paper, serving as vehicles for money laundering. Meanwhile, life followed its painful but necessary course. Mary spent her days preparing for motherhood, organizing the baby's clothes, reading books on childcare, and trying to keep her mind focused on the future instead of the past. But the nights were difficult, filled with disturbing dreams where she relived happy moments with Roderick, only to wake up and remember reality. Roderick tried to contact her several times, sending long messages apologizing, begging for a chance to talk, to explain his version of events. Mary did not respond. There was nothing he could say that would change what he had done. No explanation that would justify the betrayal and cowardice shown in the car park when Gabrielle attacked her. As for Gabrielle, the case against her was ongoing. The police located her and she was summoned to give a statement. According to information that reached Mary through Dr. Henry, Gabrielle had hired an expensive solicitor and was denying the accusations, claiming that Mary had provoked the confrontation. But the building's security cameras where the incident occurred had captured everything, and the evidence was unequivocal. A month after the incident, Raphael achieved something significant in his investigation. One of the construction company's investors, a businessman named Marcus Taylor, had decided to break his silence. Tired of seeing his resources diverted and concerned about the legal implications, he sought out Raphael, offering to share information and documents that proved the corruption. Among these documents were emails exchanged between company executives, including Roderick, discussing ways to conceal the diversions and manipulate audits. Raphael showed the documents to Mary, and she felt as if the ground disappeared beneath her feet once again. Roderick was not just an unfaithful husband, he was also an active participant in corruption schemes that harmed the city and its citizens. The man she thought she knew never truly existed. Raphael's investigation began to take shape and depth. Marcus Taylor, the investor who had decided to cooperate, became a fundamental piece in understanding the entire network of corruption that spread throughout the construction company. In a discreet meeting in his private office in Canary Wharf, he showed Raphael and Mary an impressive amount of documents he had gathered over months of growing suspicions. Marcus was a middle-aged man, looking tired but determined. He explained that he began to suspect when the numbers presented at board meetings didn't make sense. Projects that should have cost millions were being budgeted at much higher values, and delivery deadlines were constantly extended without convincing justifications. When he tried to question, he was silenced with elaborate technical excuses and veiled threats about harming the company's reputation. Among the documents he shared, there were particularly revealing emails. In one of them, Roderick discussed with other executives how to manipulate audit reports to hide suspicious transfers. In another, there were mentions of bank accounts in tax havens and shell companies used to launder money diverted from public contracts. The most shocking was an email where someone had written something about resolving a problem that could expose the scheme, and Roderick's response said that when the problem disappeared, everything would return to normal. Mary felt a chill down her spine as she read that. What problem was that? Could it be her? The pregnant wife who might discover secrets through her proximity to Roderick? The idea that she might have been seen as an obstacle to be removed was terrifying. Raphael also noticed the implication and suggested that perhaps Gabrielle's attack had not just been a fit of jealousy, but part of something larger. Marcus agreed that there was more to the story than met the eye. He revealed that Gabrielle was not just the project manager. She was also the connection between the construction company and some of the shell companies. She had access to sensitive accounts and information, and was apparently deeply involved in the scheme. Her relationship with Roderick might have been, from the start, a way to keep him committed and silenced about any irregularities he might discover. This revelation completely changed Mary's perspective on the situation. Gabrielle was not just the obsessive mistress she imagined. She was a woman involved in illegal activities, possibly dangerous in ways that went beyond the physical assault she had already committed. Mary felt fear, but also a growing determination to pursue this, to ensure that justice was done. Raphael decided to write an investigative piece about the case. As a respected journalist, his work would carry weight and could pressure the authorities to act. But first, he needed more evidence, witnesses willing to speak, irrefutable proof. He began interviewing former employees of the construction company, people who had been fired or who resigned because they disagreed with the company's practices. One of these witnesses was particularly important. Her name was Claudia, a former accountant who worked at the company for 5 years, before being abruptly dismissed when she started asking questions about discrepancies in the books. She had kept copies of documents she considered suspicious, waiting for the right moment to use them. Upon learning of Raphael's investigation through a mutual contact, she offered to help. Claudia brought detailed spreadsheets showing how money was moved, documents of transfers to offshore accounts, and even recordings of conversations she had secretly made when she realized she was being pressured to falsify reports. In one of the recordings, Roderick's voice could be clearly heard instructing her to alter numbers in a quarterly balance sheet. As the investigation progressed, Mary's personal life followed its own turbulent course. Her belly grew, and she was already in her 8th month of pregnancy. Despite all the stress and trauma of the past few months, her daughter continued to develop healthily. Mary found comfort in the baby's movements, in the gentle kicks she felt mainly at night, reminding her that something good would still come of it all. One afternoon, she received an unexpected visit. It was Mrs. Eleanor, Roderick's mother. Mary hadn't seen her since before the incident in the car park, and the relationship between them had always been cordial but distant. Mrs. Eleanor was a traditional woman, strict in her beliefs, and had always defended her son under any circumstances. But when she entered Raphael's apartment where Mary was staying, her expression was different, carrying the weight of guilt and regret. They sat in the living room, and after an initial uncomfortable silence, Mrs. Eleanor began to speak. She said that Roderick had finally told her the truth about everything that had happened, about the affair with Gabriel, about the attack Mary had suffered. Mrs. Eleanor admitted that she had always known her son had flaws, that he tended to be selfish and immature, but she had never imagined he was capable of so much betrayal and cowardice. With a choked voice, she apologized to Mary. She said that as a mother she had always tried to protect her son, but that now she understood that in doing so, she had allowed him to become a man without responsibility for his actions. She said that the granddaughter who was coming deserved a better grandfather than Roderick was being as a father, and that she, as a grandmother, would do her best to compensate for her own son's failures. Mary was surprised by Mrs. Eleanor's vulnerability. It was rare to see such a strong woman show emotions so openly. She accepted the apology, not because she forgave Roderick through her, but because she recognized the courage it took for her mother-in-law to come there and admit the mistakes of the son she had always blindly defended. Mrs. Eleanor then did something Mary didn't expect. She took an old rosary from her neck with dark wooden beads worn by time. She explained that it was a family heirloom passed down from generation to generation and that it always belonged to the eldest matriarch. But she wanted Mary to have it now, as a symbol that she and her daughter were part of that family, regardless of what happened to the marriage. Mary held the rosary carefully, feeling the weight of the worn beads in her hands. She wasn't particularly religious, but she understood the meaning of that gesture. It was a bridge being built, a way of saying that the child who was coming would not be deprived of her family roots because of her father's mistakes. She thanked her, genuinely moved. After Mrs. Eleanor's departure, Mary reflected on the complexity of human relationships. It was easy to paint everyone related to Roderick with the same brush of betrayal and disappointment, but Mrs. Eleanor had shown that people could grow, admit mistakes, and seek redemption. Perhaps there was hope that, even amidst so much suffering, something positive could emerge. Meanwhile, the net around the construction company and its corrupt executives began to close. Raphael, along with Marcus and Dr. Henry, prepared a complete dossier with all the evidence gathered. Marcus used his influence to schedule an extraordinary meeting of the company's board of directors where the evidence would be formally presented. They also contacted the Crown Prosecution Service, which had already been investigating the company separately after anonymous complaints. The board meeting was scheduled for a Monday morning, and Raphael obtained permission to be present as an observer, officially there to cover the event journalistically. Mary wanted to accompany him, despite being in late pregnancy. She wanted to see the final confrontation with her own eyes. She wanted to be present when the truth finally came to light. On the morning of the meeting, they dressed formally and took a taxi to the construction company building. The meeting room was imposing, with a huge oval table of dark wood leather armchairs and an entire glass wall overlooking the London skyline. The board members arrived gradually, some already aware of the accusations that would be presented, others completely oblivious to what was to come. Roderick entered last, accompanied by Gabrielle. Upon seeing Mary there, his face paled. Gabrielle, on the other hand, maintained an arrogant expression, as if the pregnant wife's presence was a minor inconvenience that would soon be resolved. They sat on the opposite side of the table, and the tension in the room was palpable. Marcus opened the meeting by thanking everyone for their presence and explaining the gravity of the situation. He began to present the documents one by one, projecting emails onto the large screen, showing spreadsheets with financial discrepancies, explaining the scheme of diversions through shell companies. With each revelation, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. When the emails involving Roderick were shown, he tried to defend himself by claiming he didn't fully understand the context, that he was merely following superior orders. But Marcus was prepared, presenting evidence that Roderick was not just a passive participant, but someone who actively proposed ways to conceal the irregularities and profited from them through undeclared bonuses. Then came the part about Gabrielle. Claudia, the former accountant, was invited into the room to testify. With a firm voice, she explained how Gabrielle had pressured her to falsify documents, how she had threatened her career when she refused, and how she eventually managed to get her fired to silence her. She presented the recordings she had made, and Gabrielle's voice echoed through the room, cold and calculating, discussing ways to manipulate external audits. Gabrielle's face finally lost its arrogance, replaced by an expression of growing panic. She tried to argue, but the evidence was undeniable. The most impactful revelation was yet to come. Marcus projected onto the screen a series of emails exchanged in the weeks prior to the attack Mary suffered. In one of them, there was a conversation between Gabrielle and another executive where she mentioned that Roderick's pregnant wife was becoming a problem, that she asked too many questions and might discover things she shouldn't. The executive's response suggested that problems needed to be managed before they caused greater damage. Mary's blood ran cold. Although there was no explicit confession that they planned the attack, the implication was there, between the lines. The confrontation in the car park might not have been just an impulsive act of jealousy, but something calculated to intimidate her or worse. Raphael, sitting beside her, held her hand tightly, feeling her tremble. At that moment, one of the board members, an experienced solicitor from the company itself, interrupted the presentation. He informed them that he had received an official notification minutes before the start of the meeting. The Crown Prosecution Service had requested access to the company's facilities and ordered the freezing of certain bank accounts while investigating the corruption allegations. Two police representatives were, at that very moment, waiting outside the meeting room. The tension exploded. Roderick abruptly stood up, knocking over his chair. He tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, a conspiracy to destroy the company, but his voice was shaky and unconvincing. Gabrielle remained seated, her face now completely pale, her hands clutching the edge of the table as if trying to anchor herself to reality. The police officers entered the room, formally introduced themselves, and explained that both Roderick and Gabrielle would need to accompany them to give a formal statement. They were not being arrested at that moment, they clarified, but were considered persons of interest in the investigation, and their cooperation was mandatory. Other executives present at the meeting were also informed that they would be summoned to testify in the coming days. Before leaving, Gabrielle finally looked at Mary. There was no more arrogance in that gaze, only a complex expression that mixed anger, despair, and perhaps a glimpse of regret. For the first time, Mary saw her not as a one-dimensional villain, but as a person who had made terrible choices and was now facing the consequences. When Roderick passed her, he tried to say something, but Mary turned her face away. There was nothing he could say at that moment that would make a difference. The man she had loved was long dead, replaced by this stranger who had chosen money, power, and selfish pleasures over the family he had built. After the police left with Roderick and Gabrielle, the meeting continued briefly. Marcus proposed the immediate suspension of all suspicious projects and the hiring of an independent external audit to fully investigate the company's finances. The board members, in shock but understanding the gravity of the situation, unanimously approved. The construction company would face difficult days ahead, but there was a chance of salvation if they acted quickly and transparently. Mary and Raphael left the building in silence. Outside, the sun shone brightly over London, indifferent to the human drama that had just unfolded. Mary felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The truth was finally exposed, and although this did not undo the pain she had felt, there was something liberating in knowing that she was not crazy, that her suspicions were valid, and that justice would begin to be served. In the following days, the story exploded in the media. Raphael published his investigative report, which was reproduced in newspapers and news websites across the country. The case became a national scandal, with debates about corporate corruption, diversion of public funds, and the need for stricter oversight in infrastructure projects. The construction company saw its shares plummet on the stock market, several contracts were suspended, and the company's future became uncertain. Mary tried to stay away from the media storm. Raphael did his best to protect her privacy, referring to her in articles only as an anonymous source related to the case. But it was impossible to completely escape the attention, especially when details about the attack she had suffered began to circulate. The investigation against Gabrielle for the physical assault gained new impetus with the revelations about her participation in the corruption scheme. Her solicitor contacted Dr. Henry, proposing a settlement. Gabrielle was willing to cooperate fully with the authorities, revealing everything she knew about the construction company's illegal operations, in exchange for a reduction in the sentence she would inevitably face. Dr. Henry consulted Mary about accepting the agreement. She thought long before responding. Part of her wanted Gabrielle to pay as much as possible for what she had done, not only to her, but to all victims of the corrupt scheme. But another part understood that Gabrielle's cooperation could help dismantle the entire network, potentially leading to the accountability of more powerful people involved in the scheme. Finally, Mary agreed to the agreement on the condition that Gabrielle permanently stayed away from her and her daughter. Dr. Henry negotiated the terms, and Gabrielle signed, committing to testify against her former accomplices and accept a restraining order prohibiting her from approaching Mary. It was during one of these negotiations that something surprising emerged. Through conversations with the solicitors and psychologists involved in the case, more about Gabrielle's past was revealed. She had indeed grown up in shelters, abandoned by her drug-addicted mother when she was only 5 years old. She was adopted at 12 by a wealthy couple, but the relationship was cold and transactional. Her adoptive parents saw her more as a successful charity project than as a genuine daughter. When they divorced 3 years later, neither wanted to assume full custody of her, and she spent the rest of her adolescence being transferred between the two houses, always feeling like an unwanted burden. This story did not justify her actions, but it helped explain the unhealthy obsession with being chosen, with being the official one, with winning over other women she saw as competition. For Gabrielle, being Roderick's preferred mistress, making him leave his wife, would be a final validation of her worth as a person. When Mary appeared pregnant, representing everything Gabrielle had never had, the stable family, genuine love, the obsession transformed into destructive rage. Understanding this gave Mary a different perspective. She did not forgive Gabrielle for the choices she had made, but she could see her as a deeply damaged person who allowed her wounds to turn into poison. It was a tragedy within another tragedy, layers of pain causing more pain. Meanwhile, Roderick was also cooperating with the authorities, albeit less voluntarily. Confronted with irrefutable evidence, his defense strategy shifted from denial to minimization. He tried to portray himself as a victim too, someone who had been pressured by superiors to participate in the scheme, but the evidence showed that he had benefited substantially from the diversions. Mary was now almost 9 months pregnant, and her total priority was preparing for her daughter's arrival. With the help of Mrs. Eleanor, who had been visiting regularly and proving to be a surprisingly solid support, she set up a complete nursery in Raphael's apartment. They bought a white cot, decorated the walls with star and moon stickers, and meticulously organized all the necessary clothes and nappies. One afternoon, while folding tiny clothes, Mary felt the first contractions. They were weak and spaced out but unmistakable. Raphael, who was home working on his laptop, immediately went into organized panic mode. He grabbed the already packed hospital bag, called a taxi, and phoned Dr. Helen to say they were on their way to the hospital. Labor was long, 17 hours of increasingly intense contractions, of controlled breathing, with Raphael and Mrs. Eleanor taking turns by her side, offering words of encouragement. There was no epidural available at that moment, so Mary faced each wave of pain with growing determination, reminding herself that at the end of it all, she would be holding her daughter. When the baby finally arrived, with a strong, healthy cry that filled the delivery room, Mary collapsed in tears of exhaustion and pure joy. The nurse placed the child in her arms, still covered in vernix, her tiny eyes closed, her minuscule fingers opening and closing. She was perfect, absolutely perfect, weighing 7 pounds and 1 ounce of pure future promise. She named her daughter Helen, in honor of the doctor who had supported her through such difficult times. Helen Sophia, her full name, Sophia being the name of her maternal grandmother, whom Mary had lost in the accident 5 years prior. It was a way to connect her daughter to her family roots, to honor those who came before, while celebrating the new beginning. Raphael held his niece with tears in his eyes, marveling at such a small and fragile being. Mrs. Eleanor, who was waiting outside, was allowed in, and upon seeing her, granddaughter for the first time cried openly, apologizing once again for everything Mary had gone through, and promising to be the best grandmother she could be. Roderick sent messages asking to visit, but Mary refused. She wasn't ready to have him there, not at that sacred moment. He would have the right to meet his daughter eventually, after all. He was the biological father. But this would be done on her terms, when she was emotionally prepared and with all necessary legal protections in place. In the following days at the hospital, Mary immersed herself in the experience of being a mother. She learned to breastfeed, to change nappies, to interpret Helen's different cries. It was exhausting and sometimes frightening, but also deeply rewarding. Every time she looked at her daughter's tiny face, she saw not the end of her failed marriage, but the beginning of something new and precious. A year had passed since that transformative night at the hospital. Mary woke up with the first rays of sun entering the window of the apartment she now called her own, a cozy space in Chelsea that she had managed to rent with the help of the maintenance Roderick was obliged to pay, and a small inheritance from her parents that she had finally decided to use. The place wasn't large, but it had 2 bedrooms, a balcony with a partial sea view, and most importantly, it was hers, a space where she was building her new life. Helen slept peacefully in the cot beside the bed, making those soft sounds babies make while dreaming. At 1 year old, she was a healthy and energetic child, with brown hair starting to curl and expressive eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her with infinite curiosity. Mary carefully got up, not to wake her, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. It was a quiet Saturday in March, and the city was beginning to prepare for Easter. From the open windows, Mary could hear the distant sound of the nearby church bells, reminding the faithful about morning mass. There was something comforting in those sounds, a sense of continuity and community that made her feel part of something larger than her own personal challenges. While waiting for the coffee to brew, she reflected on how much her life had changed in that year. The first few months after Helen's birth were intense, learning to balance the needs of a newborn with ongoing legal proceedings and her own emotional recovery from the trauma she had experienced. There were sleepless nights, moments of doubt about her ability to do everything alone, but also daily discoveries of strength she didn't know she possessed. Raphael continued to be her safe harbor, visiting regularly, helping with Helen whenever she needed, being the loving and present uncle his niece deserved. Mrs. Eleanor had also become an essential part of her support network, coming twice a week to spend time with her granddaughter, bringing homemade food and offering wisdom from someone who had already raised children. The relationship between them had evolved from a distant formality to a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared love for Helen. As for Roderick, the relationship remained complicated but functional. After months of negotiations through solicitors, they established a visitation agreement. Roderick saw Helen once a week, always supervised in the first few months, and gradually these visits became more autonomous as he demonstrated the ability to be a responsible father. Mary couldn't completely forgive him for what he had done, Perhaps she never would, but she had learned. To separate the husband who betrayed her from the father, Helen deserved to have, however imperfect. Roderick had faced significant consequences for his actions. The legal process related to the corruption at the construction company resulted in an alternative sentence including community service and professional restrictions. He lost his position at the company, which ended up being sold to new investors after a complete restructuring. He had to sell the apartment in Brighton Marina to pay fines and part of the restitution ordered by the court. He now worked as an independent consultant, slowly rebuilding his reputation, and according to his occasional emails to Mary, he was in therapy to understand how he had reached that point of destruction. Gabrielle had a different fate. Her cooperation with the authorities resulted in a reduced sentence, but she still faced legal consequences for the attack on Mary and for her participation in the corruption scheme. She served a year of home detention, followed by extensive community service. According to what Mary had learned through Dr. Henry, she was also in intensive therapy, working to understand and heal the abandonment traumas that had shaped her destructive choices. She rigorously kept her distance from Mary and Helen, respecting the restraining order, and was apparently trying to rebuild her life in a healthier way. The construction company, after the full investigation and the departure of the corrupt executives, managed to survive under new leadership. Marcus Taylor took a more active role on the board, ensuring transparency and implementing rigorous controls to prevent future diversions. The company faced lawsuits and had to make significant restitutions, but avoided complete bankruptcy and managed to keep some of its honest employees employed. Mary had resumed her own career. Before marrying, she worked as a graphic designer, but had left her job when she became pregnant, planning to be a full-time mother for Helen's first year. Now, with her daughter a little more independent and settled into a routine, she had started accepting freelance projects, working from home while Helen napped or was with her grandmother. It was liberating to rediscover this part of herself, the creative professional who existed beyond the roles of betrayed wife and single mother. That specific morning, while having coffee on the balcony watching Helen play with her toys on the living room rug, the doorbell rang. It was Marcus Taylor, who had asked to visit her. Mary invited him in, making more coffee while he sat down and greeted Helen, who looked at him with childlike curiosity. Marcus brought news. The final judgment of the construction company case had concluded the previous week. All involved had been formally convicted or acquitted according to the evidence. Roderick had accepted his sentence, as had other executives. More importantly, the Crown Prosecution Service had managed to recover a significant portion of the diverted funds, which would be returned to public coffers and partially used to compensate indirect victims of the scheme, including small suppliers who had been harmed. As part of this restitution, Marcus explained, financial compensation for Mary had been approved. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a significant amount that recognized the suffering she had faced and could help ensure a more stable future for her and Helen. Marcus handed her an envelope with the official documents. Mary held the envelope, feeling its physical and symbolic weight in her hands. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about justice, about the recognition that what had happened to her was wrong, that she was a victim who deserved reparation. She thanked Marcus not only for the news, but for everything he had done, for having the courage to expose the corruption even knowing it would harm his own investments in the short term. Marcus smiled, saying that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it in the end. He stayed a few more minutes playing with Helen, who was fascinated by his colorful tie, before saying goodbye and leaving Mary with her thoughts. That afternoon, Mary decided to walk along the promenade with Helen in her pushchair. The beach was busy with families enjoying the weekend, children building sandcastles, couples walking hand in hand. The sea was calm, reflecting the clear blue sky, and there was a gentle breeze that carried the smell of salt and life. As she walked, Mary thought about everything she had experienced in the last year and a half. The betrayal, the assault, the revelation of corruption, Helen's birth, the rebuilding of her life. They were the most difficult months she had ever faced, moments when she doubted her ability to overcome, nights when she cried thinking she would never be happy again. But there she was, walking under the London Son with her healthy and happy daughter, with friends and family who supported her, with a re-emerging career and now with financial security to plan for the future. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she married Roderick, full of hopes and dreams, but it was a good life, a life she had built with her own hands from the rubble of the previous one. Mary realized something fundamental on that walk. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or accepting what had happened, but rather freeing herself from the burden of carrying anger and pain indefinitely. She had forgiven not for Roderick, nor for Gabriel, but for herself, to be able to move forward without being permanently defined by the worst things that were done to her. That night, after putting Helen to sleep, softly singing a lullaby her own mother used to sing, Mary sat on the balcony with the rosary Mrs. Eleanor had given her. She didn't pray in the traditional sense. That wasn't how she related to spirituality, but she held the worn beads and reflected on gratitude. She was grateful for having survived that terrible year, grateful that Helen was healthy, grateful for Raphael, for Mrs. Eleanor, for Dr. Henry, for Marcus, for all the people who appeared in her path offering support when she needed it most. Grateful even for the pain, because it was through it that she discovered how strong she truly was. She lit a small candle she kept on the balcony, a habit she had recently developed. She watched the flame dance softly in the night breeze, small but persistent, illuminating the space around it. It was a visual reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always light, always hope, always the possibility of a new beginning. Her phone vibrated, with a message. It was Raphael asking if she and Helen would like to have lunch with him on Sunday. She smiled and replied yes, they would love to. This was what her new life was made of, these small moments of connection, these simple routines that built, brick by brick, a meaningful existence. Mary looked at the London night sky, where stars began to appear among the city lights. She thought of Helen, sleeping peacefully in the next room, of all the first times she would still witness, the first steps, the first words, the first days of school, all the joys and challenges of motherhood that were yet to come. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid of the future. She felt curiosity, anticipation, even excitement. Because now she knew that, whatever happened, she was capable of facing it. She had survived the storm, and in the process she had discovered that she was stronger, more resilient, and more complete than she had ever imagined herself to be. The candle flame flickered but did not go out, continuing to glow softly in the London night. And Mary smiled because she understood that that small light was herself, persisting, shining, refusing to be extinguished by adversity. She had found her way back to the light, and this time it was a light that came from within, unshakable and eternally hers. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Mary, a woman who found strength where there seemed to be nothing left, has touched your hearts. This narrative reminds us that even in the most painful situations, there is always the possibility of rebuilding, and that light always finds a way back, especially when it comes from within ourselves. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel to follow more narratives that explore the complexity of human relationships and the extraordinary capacity we all have to overcome adversity. Leave your like if Mary inspired you, and share in the comments how this story made you feel. Every day we bring unique stories that celebrate human resilience. Your participation fuels our community and motivates us to continue telling these stories that need to be heard. Until the next emotional journey we have prepared especially for you, for